The fall of the untouchable. The towering glass spire of Cross Global Enterprises rose like a blade into the Manhattan skyline, its mirrored walls gleaming in the pale light of dawn. Inside its uppermost floor, the world of power and money pulsed in quiet rhythm, the rustle of silk ties, the muted hum of conversation, the echo of ambition in every word. At the center of it all stood Nathaniel Cross, a man the press had named the Wolf of Wall Street Reborn. His dark hair was streaked with gray at the temples, his suit perfectly cut, his expression sharp and unreadable. He had built his empire from a rented basement office into a multi-billion-dollar financial fortress. To the world, Nathaniel was brilliance incarnate, a man who could bend markets with his words. But beneath the polished marble and confidence, there lived a heart made of glass and secrets that time could not bury. That morning, the boardroom was silent, except for Nathaniel's voice. 12 board members, seasoned men with silver hair and sharp eyes, listened as he unveiled his latest triumph, a merger that would make Cross Global the most powerful financial institution in North America. "Gentlemen," Nathaniel said, his tone calm but carrying the weight of command, "this acquisition will increase our market share by 37% and eliminate 2 competitors. By end of business today, I expect your signatures. No delays, no hesitation." He clicked through the slides on the digital screen, numbers flashing like weaponry: profits, growth, dominance. To Nathaniel, life was a chessboard. Emotions were weaknesses. People were pieces. He had learned that long ago, the day he decided that love was a distraction and empathy a liability. As the room filled with murmured agreement, Nathaniel leaned on the table, his hand tightening around a pen. The pen trembled slightly, something he didn't notice at first. But then came the ache, small, almost imperceptible behind his sternum. He ignored it. He was used to discomfort. It had been there for years, in different forms. He moved to speak again, but his breath caught. The ache grew sharper, spreading like fire beneath his ribs. A cold sweat broke along his brow. His vision began to blur. Someone asked if he was all right, but the words came through water. He gripped the table harder, trying to steady himself. Pain shot down his left arm, his heart pounding violently as the edges of his sight darkened. In the reflection of the glass wall, he saw his own face, a powerful man undone by something invisible. The boardroom fell into chaos. "Call an ambulance!" someone shouted. Nathaniel collapsed to his knees, gasping for air that wouldn't come. The chandelier above blurred into spinning light. He thought of nothing, no empire, no deals, no rivals. Only one image, uninvited, flickered in his fading mind. A young woman's face, brown eyes full of warmth, a laugh he had tried for years to forget. Then everything went black. The ambulance screamed through the city, slicing through red lights as rain began to fall. Inside, paramedics worked frantically, their voices urgent, commanding. Nathaniel's body convulsed as they shocked his heart once, twice, each jolt lighting up the dim cabin. "We're losing him," one of them yelled. His assistant, a young woman named Grace, sat in the corner, trembling as she spoke into her phone. "Yes, Mrs. Cross, he collapsed during the meeting. They think it's his heart. They're taking him to Metropolitan General." She paused, her voice breaking. He flatlined twice in the ambulance. "They're trying to bring him back." The rain beat harder on the windshield as the city blurred past, the world reduced to flashing lights and sirens. At Metropolitan General Hospital, the emergency team was already waiting by the doors. Nurses rushed forward, gurneys rolled, monitors beeped. The air smelled of antiseptic and urgency. The lead physician stepped into the light, Dr. Amelia Hart. Her hair was tied back neatly, her white coat crisp even after 14 hours on shift. Her eyes, warm but sharp, scanned the monitors as she barked instructions. "Get him to OR3 now!" Cardiac team on standby. "I want a full scan and prep for surgery. Move!" Her voice was calm but carried the gravity of experience. Nurses obeyed instantly. Then, as the gurney rolled past her, she caught sight of the patient's face and the world stopped. For a second, the sterile corridor dissolved around her. She wasn't Dr. Amelia Hart anymore. She was the woman who once stood barefoot in a tiny apartment, waiting for a man who never came home. Her pulse froze and she felt the weight of 12 lost years pressing down on her. Nathaniel Cross, the name she hadn't spoken aloud in a decade. The man who had promised her forever, then vanished without a word when success called his name. Her hands trembled slightly on the gurney rail. A nurse's voice broke the spell. Doctor, are you okay? Amelia blinked, forcing herself back into the moment. Her professional armor snapped into place. I'm fine, she said evenly, her tone controlled. Let's save him. Under the blinding lights of the operating room, time lost its meaning. The monitors beeped steadily as Amelia worked with surgical precision, her hands steady even when her heart wasn't. Each incision, each movement was guided by instinct and training, not emotion. But inside her chest, old wounds reopened. She had imagined this moment so many times, seeing him again, but never like this. Not like this, fighting for the life of the man who once left her to fight for hers alone. Clamp ready, she said quietly. Pressure dropping. Her team responded instantly, trusting her leadership. The surgery was long, grueling, but Amelia never faltered. When the heart monitor finally steadied to a strong rhythm, she exhaled slowly, stepping back. You saved him, Dr. Hart, the surgical nurse said softly. Relief in her voice. Amelia nodded, exhaustion creeping into her bones. She peeled off her gloves, tossed them into the bin, and stared at the motionless figure on the table. He looked smaller now, weaker, nothing like the man who once commanded the world. He'll live, she said quietly, more to herself than anyone. For now. In the scrub room, Amelia washed her hands slowly, the water turning pink, then clear. Her reflection in the mirror looked back at her, older, wiser, and harder. The young woman Nathaniel had known was gone. That girl had believed in dreams and promises. The woman standing here believed only in duty and resilience. She dried her hands and pressed them against the sink to steady herself. Why now? She whispered to the empty room. Why after all these years? Outside, the hospital hallway buzzed with life. Phones ringing, shoes clicking, voices calling. But for Amelia, the world had gone silent. She turned once more to look through the glass window into the recovery ward. Nathaniel lay there, pale against the white sheets, machines keeping his heart steady. She had saved him with the same hands he once held when he swore he'd never let her go. Life, she thought, had a cruel sense of irony. As she walked away from the glass, her pager beeped for another emergency. She straightened her shoulders, pushing back the storm of emotions that threatened to break through. There would be time to feel later. For now, she was a doctor, and doctors saved lives, even those that had broken their own. Back in the recovery room, Nathaniel stirred faintly, his eyelids fluttering open to the dim glow of evening. The world swam in blurs and whispers, but one face came into focus. The face of the woman standing quietly by his bedside. Her eyes met his, calm yet distant. For a moment he thought he was dreaming, but when she spoke, the sound of her voice struck through the fog of anesthesia and memory. Welcome back, Mr. Cross, she said softly, her tone neutral, professional, but her gaze unflinching. Nathaniel's dry lips parted, and a faint smile ghosted across his face, laced with disbelief and regret. Amelia, he whispered, her name breaking the silence like a confession, and for the first time in 12 years, both of them stood on the same ground again. Not as lovers, not as enemies, but as two people bound by fate, forgiveness, and the fragile beat of a healing heart. The woman he left behind. The soft hum of the hospital monitors blended with the steady rhythm of rain tapping against the tall glass windows. Metropolitan General was quieter now, the rush of the day replaced by the quiet order of the night shift. The lights were dimmed in the recovery ward, the smell of antiseptic and coffee drifting faintly through the air. Nathaniel Cross stirred weakly against his pillow, consciousness returning in fragments. White ceilings, murmured voices, the faint pulse of a heartbeat monitor beside him. His body felt heavy, his chest bandaged, his throat raw from the breathing tube. He blinked slowly, disoriented, his mind trying to catch up to what had happened. For the first time in his life, Nathaniel didn't feel in control. He didn't even feel like the man whose name made markets tremble. He just felt human. When the door opened softly, he turned his head, and for a heartbeat he wondered if he was still dreaming. Standing there, clipboard in hand, was a woman he thought he would never see again. Not in this life, not in any. Dr. Amelia Hart stepped into the room quietly, her white coat rustling slightly as she checked the monitor readings. Her hair was tied back neatly, though a few strands had escaped to frame her face. Time had changed her, but only in ways that made her more striking. There was strength now where softness once lived, calm where uncertainty had once flickered. Nathaniel's breath caught, not from pain this time, but from recognition so sharp it almost hurt. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was heavy with memories, old promises, broken nights, and words that had never been said. Amelia's eyes flicked to him briefly before focusing on her notes. Her tone when she finally spoke was cool and professional. "How are you feeling, Mr. Cross?" she asked, not using his first name as though the familiarity had long expired. He swallowed hard, his voice a rasp. "Alive," he said quietly. "Thanks to you." Amelia didn't look up. "You were lucky," she replied evenly. "Massive blockage in the left anterior artery. If your team hadn't gotten you here within minutes, you wouldn't have made it. You should rest." She turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Amelia." The name slipped out like a prayer, as if saying it might undo the 12 years that had stretched between them. She froze, her hand tightening on the door handle. For a moment her composure cracked, just a flicker. But then she turned back, her eyes calm, unreadable. "Please don't," she said softly. "Not here. Not now." Nathaniel wanted to speak, to explain, to say all the things he'd rehearsed in silence for years. But the words wouldn't come. There was too much between them, too much damage that apologies could never touch. So instead, he watched her walk out of the room, her figure vanishing down the sterile white hallway like the ghost of a life he'd once thrown away. Days passed slowly in recovery. The empire Nathaniel had built now ran without him, or so he thought. Newspapers reported his hospitalization in cold headlines. Stock analysts speculated. Investors panicked. But none of it seemed to matter now. As he sat in his hospital bed, staring at the muted skyline beyond the window, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. Emptiness. He had everything a man could want: wealth, power, recognition. But lying there, heart-scarred and body weak, he realized how little any of it meant without someone to share it with. Every empire, no matter how vast, felt meaningless when built on hollow ground. He saw Amelia every day, though she kept their interactions strictly clinical. She came in with her clipboard, checked his vitals, adjusted his medications, and left. No warmth, no bitterness, just distance. But in that distance he saw strength. She had rebuilt herself from the ashes of what he had burned. She spoke with quiet authority, moved with confidence. He saw the faint tiredness under her eyes, the way she rubbed her wrist after long hours, the gentleness with which she treated every patient, even those who shouted, cried, or cursed. Nathaniel realized that somewhere along the way, the woman he had once loved had become everything he had always wanted to be: steady, selfless, unbreakable. Late one night, unable to sleep, Nathaniel stepped carefully out of bed, wincing at the pull in his chest. He walked slowly to the window and looked out at the city lights below. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to think, not as a CEO, not as a strategist, but as a man. He thought of the night he left Amelia. The memory hit like a tide, cruel and unrelenting. He had been younger then, hungry for success, desperate to escape the weight of poverty and insignificance. Amelia had believed in him when no one else did. She had shared her tiny apartment, cooked cheap dinners, listened to his dreams. She had given him everything. And when his first company took off, he told himself that love was a luxury he couldn't afford. The night she told him she was pregnant, he remembered the way she had smiled nervously, holding his hand, and he had pulled it away. He had told her he wasn't ready, that the timing was wrong, that his future couldn't include a family. She had cried, begged him to stay, but his ambition had been louder than her tears. He told her she'd ruin everything. And then one morning she woke up to an empty apartment and a note that simply said, "I'm sorry." Nathaniel closed his eyes, shame burning through him even now. He had told himself for years that it was necessary, that someday he would make it right when his empire was secure. But someday never came. He buried himself in work, in money, in hollow relationships that filled the silence but never healed the wound. And now fate had thrown him back into the life he'd abandoned. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his life building walls of glass and steel, only to find himself saved by the one person whose heart he had shattered. The next morning, as Amelia entered for rounds, she found him awake, sitting upright. He looked different, less like the titan of finance, more like the man she had once known, stripped of arrogance and pride. "You should be resting," she said calmly, checking the monitors. "I couldn't sleep," he admitted. "Too many ghosts in this room." She didn't respond, but he caught the slight tremor in her hand as she wrote on his chart. "Amelia," he began quietly, "I know you don't owe me a single word. I know what I did was unforgivable. But if there's any part of you that still believes I can be better, please give me the chance to say I'm sorry." She looked at him then, really looked, into the eyes of the man who had once been her world. There was remorse there, raw and real. For a heartbeat, she wanted to let herself feel it. But then she remembered the nights alone, the tears, the fear of raising a child without a father, the struggle to finish med school with a baby on her hip and exhaustion in her bones. Her heart hardened again, the walls rebuilding themselves. "I'm not interested in your apologies," she said quietly. "You made your choices. So did I." She turned to leave but paused at the door. Her voice softened, almost a whisper. "You survived, Nathaniel. Maybe that's your second chance. Don't waste it." As she disappeared into the hallway, Nathaniel's gaze lingered on her name embroidered on her coat, Dr. Amelia Hart. He whispered it under his breath like a promise to the air. He had wasted years chasing numbers that never filled the void. But now, seeing her, he realized there was still something left to fight for. Not wealth, not redemption in the public eye, but redemption in her eyes, in the life he might still touch if only he could prove he had changed. Later that evening, as nurses checked his vitals and dimmed the lights, Nathaniel overheard a conversation outside his room. Two nurses were talking softly, unaware that he was awake. "Dr. Hart's son's science project won the state fair," one said with a smile. "She's so proud. The kid's a genius, just like her." The other nurse laughed. "Of course he is. Runs in the family." The word struck him like lightning. Dr. Hart's son. His heart began to race, not from fear, but from something deeper. He felt the air leave his lungs as the realization crept in. Amelia's son. Her son, who would be about 11 years old now. The same age as the child he'd walked away from. The same child he had never known. Nathaniel's hand went to his chest, not from pain this time, but from something far more powerful. Hope tangled with guilt. Regret mixed with longing. If that child was his, if fate had truly given him this impossible second chance, then perhaps his story wasn't over yet. Perhaps in saving his life, Amelia had unknowingly given him a chance to find the part of himself he'd lost long ago. The part that could still love, still care, still make right what he had once destroyed. He leaned back against the pillow, staring at the rain streaking down the window pane, his heart aching not from weakness but from something almost holy, a promise forming in the quiet of that hospital room. He would not run again, not this time. And somewhere down the corridor, unaware of his awakening, Amelia paused for a moment, her fingers tightening on a folder that held her son's photo. Something told her that the past she had spent years burying was coming back, and this time it would demand to be faced. The weight of regret. Morning sunlight streamed through the hospital blinds, painting thin golden stripes across the sterile floor. Nathaniel sat upright in bed, staring out at the city that once danced at his command. He could see the jagged silhouette of his own corporate tower far in the distance, the monument to a man who had believed power could substitute for peace. The skyline that had once filled him with pride now seemed cold, unfeeling, hollow. The screens and the suits, the meetings and the mergers. None of it mattered in this room where the sound of a single heartbeat monitor decided his worth more than any billion-dollar deal ever could. The reality of his fragility hung over him like a storm cloud. He had come close to death, and in the quiet moments between medication rounds he began to realize how truly empty his victories had been. He had conquered everything except himself. He hadn't seen Amelia since the previous night, but her presence lingered in the air like a faint scent, calm, purposeful, impossible to forget. The nurses spoke of her with respect, the kind reserved for people who not only healed bodies but touched souls. Nathaniel listened quietly as they described her tireless dedication, her kindness to the elderly, her patience with frightened children. He found himself wondering how she had done it all, how she had carried the weight of her profession and motherhood while he was chasing wealth across continents. The thought gnawed at him, carving out a hollow space inside his chest that no amount of success had ever filled. That afternoon, as rain began to fall again, soft, steady, unending, Amelia entered his room for the first time in 2 days. She greeted him with her usual professionalism, her eyes unreadable behind the calm surface of her expression. Nathaniel noticed the faint circles beneath her eyes and the way her hand trembled ever so slightly when she adjusted his IV. She was exhausted, but she still stood tall, still carried herself with quiet dignity. He wanted to say something, anything, to bridge the ocean that time had built between them. Instead, he simply said, "You look tired." She gave a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. "That's part of the job," she replied softly. "We all get tired. We just don't stop." He studied her face for a long time, memorizing every line every scar time had etched there. And for the first time in years, he admired someone not for what they achieved but for what they endured. When she turned to leave, he spoke again, his voice low, uncertain. "I heard you have a son." Amelia froze for half a second, just enough for him to notice. Her back stiffened before she turned slowly, her eyes wary. "Yes," she said finally, after a pause that seemed to stretch across the room. "I do." He swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "He must be proud of you." She looked down at her clipboard, her tone clipped and cautious. "He doesn't think about pride. He thinks about homework, soccer, and how much chocolate he can sneak before bedtime." Her attempt at humor was gentle, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of pain. Nathaniel's breath caught. He wanted to ask more, but the boundary in her gaze warned him not to. "He's lucky," he murmured. "He has you." Amelia's expression softened briefly. "He has what he needs," she said quietly, then turned and walked out, her footsteps echoing in the corridor like fading memories. When the door closed, Nathaniel leaned back, his chest aching, not from the wound that had almost killed him, but from the truth pressing against his heart. He could feel it now with absolute certainty. That boy wasn't just Amelia's son. He was their son. The timing, the age, the way she avoided his eyes whenever the topic came up. It all pointed to one truth that made his stomach twist with guilt. He had a child he had never met. A child he had left behind before he was even born. The realization hit him harder than any heart attack ever could. The next few days passed in a blur of medication, therapy sessions, and restless thoughts. Nathaniel's body was healing, but his mind was a battlefield. He thought of the life Amelia must have lived. The sleepless nights, the endless studying while caring for an infant, the sacrifices he had never witnessed. Each time he imagined her rocking their baby to sleep alone, his throat tightened with remorse. How had she done it? How had she survived his abandonment and still found the strength to save lives every day? The more he thought about it, the more he felt unworthy of her forgiveness, or of the child he had never known. One evening, a nurse brought him dinner and set it on the table beside him. As she adjusted his tray, she smiled politely. "Dr. Hart's son stopped by earlier," she said casually. "He brought her lunch. Sweet kid, polite, smart, looks just like her." Nathaniel's pulse quickened. "He was here?" he asked, trying to sound calm. The nurse nodded. "He waited in the hallway while she was in surgery. She told him not to bother the patients. He just sat there reading. He has her eyes." She left, humming to herself, but Nathaniel couldn't breathe. His chest tightened with an ache that had nothing to do with his surgery. He imagined the boy, his boy, sitting out there only a few walls away, a living, breathing reminder of everything he had thrown away. That night, Nathaniel couldn't sleep. The thought of his son kept him awake. The idea that a child with his blood was out there, growing, learning, dreaming, and he had missed it all. The first steps, the first words, the first day of school, all gone. Memories that belonged to another man, another father, another version of himself that had never existed. He rose from bed, ignoring the dull pain in his chest, and walked slowly to the window. The city lights blurred in the drizzle. He placed a trembling hand over his heart and whispered, "I'll find a way. I'll make it right." The next morning, when Amelia came in, he waited until the nurse left before speaking. "You never told me," he said quietly. She didn't respond, simply kept writing on her chart. "Amelia," he continued, "please. I know he's mine. I can see it in your eyes every time I say the word son." Her pen stopped mid-stroke. She stood there for a moment, her back to him, breathing slowly. When she turned, her face was composed, but her eyes shimmered with unspoken emotion. "It doesn't matter whose he is," she said softly. "He's my child. He's happy. He's safe. That's all that matters." Nathaniel's voice broke. "He deserves to know the truth. He deserves to know his father." She shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "His father made his choice 12 years ago. You left, Nathaniel. You didn't just walk away from me. You walked away from him before he even existed. I raised him without your help, without your name, without your money. You don't get to walk back in and rewrite that story. Her words pierced through him, each one sharper than the last. He wanted to argue, to defend himself, but the truth stood between them, undeniable. He had abandoned them. He had chosen ambition over love, wealth over family, and now he was paying the price. His eyes stung as he whispered, "I don't want to rewrite anything. I just want to know him. I want to make sure he knows he wasn't unwanted, that he was my biggest mistake only because I didn't stay to see how perfect he was." Amelia's lips trembled, and for a moment, her mask slipped. He could see the exhaustion, the buried hurt, the years of loneliness she had carried in silence. She looked at him as if seeing not the billionaire or the patient, but the broken man beneath. "You can't fix the past, Nathaniel," she said finally, her voice shaking. "But maybe you can stop running from it. If you really want to prove you've changed, don't do it for me. Do it for him. Be someone he can be proud of, even if he never knows who you are." She turned and left before he could respond, leaving him alone with the sound of his heartbeat echoing through the monitor. Her words echoed louder still, filling every corner of his mind. Be someone he can be proud of. He thought about that long after the room went dark. The man he had been, ruthless, proud, untouchable, would never have understood those words. But the man he was becoming did. In the weeks that followed, as Nathaniel recovered and prepared for discharge, he made silent promises to himself. He donated a massive sum anonymously to the children's wing of the hospital. He called his company and instructed his board to start a charity fund for medical scholarships in Amelia's name, without telling her. It wasn't about redemption in the public eye anymore. It was about quiet atonement, about creating something good from the wreckage of his choices. When he finally walked out of the hospital, the air felt different, cleaner, realer. For the first time in decades, he didn't have a chauffeur waiting, didn't have an assistant holding his schedule, didn't have reporters chasing quotes. He stood alone, a man stripped of everything but the chance to start again. As he looked back at the hospital windows glinting in the afternoon sun, he whispered a silent prayer. Not for success, not for forgiveness, but for the strength to become the kind of man his son could someday call father without shame. And inside that same building, watching him through a high-floor window, Amelia felt something stir inside her that she hadn't felt in years. Not forgiveness, not love, but a fragile, dangerous hope that maybe, just maybe, people could change when the heart finally learned the weight of regret. The son he never knew, 2 months later, the world outside Nathaniel's glass penthouse looked the same as it always had. Skyscrapers slicing through fog, neon signs flickering against clouds, the dull hum of city life beating endlessly below. But for Nathaniel, nothing felt familiar anymore. The sharp edges of his life as a billionaire had dulled, and the silence of his luxurious apartment had become unbearable. The walls that once held the sound of board meetings and stock updates now echoed with his thoughts, and each echo whispered the same question over and over. What would my son think of me? He had built an empire that touched every part of the city, yet he had no hand in the life of the one boy who carried his blood. Every morning he woke early, brewed his coffee, and stared at the photo of Amelia he had secretly printed from a hospital newsletter, her smiling beside a group of patients she had saved. That image reminded him of all the years he missed, the moments he could never reclaim, and the choices that had driven her so far away. Nathaniel's doctors had told him to take it slow, but he threw himself into work again, not for money this time, but for redemption. He restructured his corporation to focus on medical technology and patient care. He converted an abandoned wing of his company into a free research center for young doctors, quietly naming it the Heart Foundation. He refused any press attention, choosing to do everything anonymously, afraid that if Amelia ever found out he was doing it for her, she'd see it as manipulation instead of remorse. Every decision he made now came from a place he barely recognized, a place that wanted to heal instead of conquer. But still, even as he rebuilt his purpose, the emptiness lingered. It wasn't enough to help strangers. He longed to know the one person who truly mattered, the boy who was half of him and half of the woman he had never stopped loving. He didn't plan it, but fate rarely asks permission. One afternoon, as he sat in the park near the hospital where he had recovered, he noticed a familiar figure sitting on a bench beneath the shade of a large oak. Amelia sat with a book in her lap, her posture relaxed but her eyes sharp, scanning the pages with that same focus he remembered from years ago. Beside her sat a boy, tall for his age, with chestnut hair that caught the light and a thoughtful expression that mirrored Nathaniel's own. The child was talking animatedly about something, waving his hands as he described it, while Amelia listened with a soft smile that spoke of deep love and patience. Nathaniel froze, his heart thundering as realization washed over him. There was no mistaking it. That was his son. The curve of his jaw, the slight furrow of his brow when he spoke, the same nervous habit of rubbing his palms when excited. It was like looking into a younger version of himself. Nathaniel stayed hidden behind the branches, afraid to move, afraid to breathe too loudly, as if one wrong sound would shatter this fragile moment. He watched them share laughter, their bond radiating something pure and unspoken. The boy had an easy joy that Nathaniel envied. He didn't carry the burden of pride or regret. He was light, untouched by the darkness of ambition. Amelia suddenly looked up, scanning the park, her eyes narrowing as if sensing something. For a fleeting second, her gaze passed over Nathaniel's spot and their eyes met. She didn't react, no anger, no fear, just quiet understanding. She turned back to the boy and said something softly before they gathered their things to leave. As they walked away, Nathaniel remained rooted to the ground, tears burning his eyes. For the first time, he saw what happiness looked like outside the walls of power, and it both healed and broke him. Later that night, he couldn't sleep. He kept replaying the image of that boy's laughter, his voice, the way Amelia's hand rested protectively on his shoulder. He imagined what it would have been like to teach him how to ride a bike, to cheer from the sidelines, to hear the word Dad for the first time. Each thought was a blade that cut deep. He sat at his piano, something he hadn't touched in years, and began to play a melody that came from somewhere buried inside his chest. It was slow, aching and uncertain, much like the man who played it. As his fingers moved over the keys, tears finally escaped down his face. The melody wasn't for anyone else, it was for the son he couldn't hold and the woman he had wronged. The sound filled the empty apartment, echoing like a confession whispered to the stars. The next morning, a letter arrived at his office. It was handwritten, the script familiar yet cautious. The envelope bore no return address, but he knew instantly who it was from. His hands trembled as he opened it. Inside, on a single sheet of cream paper, Amelia had written, "I saw you in the park. He doesn't know who you are, and I want it to stay that way, for now. He's happy, and I won't let anything disturb that. But I saw how you looked at him, Nathaniel. Maybe you really have changed. If you mean what you said, that you want to make things right, then do it quietly. Don't seek forgiveness. Earn it through kindness. And if you truly want to help, volunteer at the foundation. They need guidance, not money." There was no signature, but the scent of faint lavender told him everything. Nathaniel read the letter a dozen times, each word sinking into his heart. She hadn't forgiven him, but she had given him something far more valuable, a chance. He decided then that he wouldn't waste it. The next day he showed up at the hospital unannounced, dressed not as a billionaire but as a man trying to start over. The staff didn't recognize him at first. He spent the entire day helping patients with paperwork, serving food, and sitting with elderly men who had no visitors. It felt strange at first, but also right. For once, he wasn't in charge, he was simply useful. And when he looked up from his work that evening and caught Amelia watching from across the hall, he saw something in her eyes that hadn't been there before. Quiet respect. Days turned into weeks, and their paths began crossing often. Their conversations remained brief and professional, but there was a shift, a softening in the air between them. Sometimes she'd ask for his help moving medical supplies and he'd stay late without complaint. Other times he'd bring coffee for the staff, always placing hers near her desk without a word. They didn't talk about the past, nor about the boy who connected them, but they didn't need to. Each small act of kindness built something fragile yet unbreakable, a bridge made of patience and sincerity. The other doctors began to notice. "Dr. Hart," one nurse whispered with a smile. "That volunteer seems awfully dedicated." Amelia would simply reply, "He's learning what healing really means." Then one afternoon, as Nathaniel was organizing medical records, a small voice echoed down the hallway, "Mom, are you ready to go?" He froze, recognizing the voice before he even turned. The boy came running toward Amelia, his backpack bouncing on his shoulders, his face bright with excitement. Amelia smiled warmly, brushing his hair back. "Almost, sweetheart," she said. Then, noticing Nathaniel standing nearby, she introduced him casually. "This is Mr. Grant. He helps us around the hospital sometimes." The boy grinned and extended his hand. "Hi, Mr. Grant. My name's Leo." Nathaniel knelt slightly, taking the boy's small hand in his. "Hi, Leo," he said softly, his voice trembling. "You've got a strong handshake." "That's good. It means you're confident." Leo laughed proudly. "Mom says that too." Nathaniel smiled, though his eyes burned. For a moment, time stood still, the man meeting his son without titles, without history, just as two strangers connected by something deeper than blood. As Amelia guided Leo toward the door, she glanced back at Nathaniel. Their eyes met again, and this time she didn't look away. There was still pain, yes, but also a flicker of acceptance, a silent acknowledgement that maybe this was enough for now. Maybe redemption didn't mean erasing the past, but learning to live in peace with its shadows. Nathaniel watched them leave, the sunlight casting a halo around them, and he whispered under his breath, "Goodbye, my boy, until the world allows otherwise." That night, for the first time in years, Nathaniel slept peacefully. He dreamt of a future not built on skyscrapers or wealth, but on moments like that handshake, a fleeting connection that carried more meaning than an empire. In his dreams, he saw Leo smiling, not as a stranger's son, but as a symbol of the man Nathaniel had become. And somewhere in the quiet corners of that dream, Amelia's voice whispered through the wind, "Change doesn't erase the past, Nathaniel. But sometimes it writes a better ending." Forgiveness isn't spoken, it's lived. The seasons changed quietly around the city, though Nathaniel barely noticed. Winter melted into spring, and with it came a gentle transformation that mirrored the one inside him. He had begun to live differently now, no longer measuring time in stock tickers or profit margins, but in the quiet, steady rhythm of meaningful days. Each morning he would wake before sunrise, pour a cup of black coffee, and watch the horizon from his balcony as the first golden light touched the glass towers of Manhattan. It was the same skyline that had once symbolized power and ambition to him, but now it looked softer, humbler, almost forgiving. It reminded him of how fragile all of it really was. His empire still existed, yes, but he no longer ruled it with an iron grip. He had placed new leadership in charge, younger minds with cleaner hearts. He didn't need to be the richest man anymore. He needed to be better than the man who had once walked through those doors without a soul. Every day, Nathaniel worked at the hospital foundation Amelia had guided him toward. He never asked for recognition, never mentioned his wealth, and never used his name to influence anyone. To the nurses, he was simply Mr. Grant, the quiet, tall man with kind eyes who fixed equipment, helped elderly patients walk the hallway, and donated toys to the children's wing without a word. Some suspected he was a man of influence, but no one asked, and he preferred it that way. The anonymity gave him peace, a freedom he hadn't known in decades. Sometimes he'd see Amelia pass by with her clipboard in hand, her white coat flowing behind her like a banner of grace. She always moved with purpose, her expression focused yet calm. Each time their eyes met, something unspoken passed between them, something fragile, like a truce built on understanding instead of words. They never discussed their past, and she never mentioned Leo in front of him, but Nathaniel felt content just being near, quietly helping her world shine brighter. Weeks turned into months, and the whispers around the hospital began to change. "Dr. Hart's foundation is expanding," one nurse said. "They're building a children's cardiac center." Nathaniel had been funding it quietly through a series of anonymous donations routed through his company. He never wanted Amelia to feel indebted or manipulated, so he stayed hidden behind paperwork and shell accounts, letting her take full credit. The center's purpose touched something deep within him. It would save children born with heart conditions, children who might otherwise never have a chance. The irony wasn't lost on him. The man whose heart had once failed from greed was now building a sanctuary to protect the hearts of others. Every brick, every light fixture, every painted wall became his silent prayer of apology, his way of leaving something good behind. One evening, as construction neared completion, Amelia found him in the garden courtyard behind the hospital. The air was cool, the scent of spring flowers drifting through the air, and a golden glow fell across the fountain where he sat reading. She approached slowly, her voice soft but firm. "You're behind it, aren't you?" she asked. Nathaniel looked up, startled, then closed his book carefully. He didn't try to deny it. "It doesn't matter who's behind it," he said quietly. "What matters is that it helps the children." Amelia crossed her arms, studying him for a long moment. "You think you can erase the past with money?" she asked, though her tone wasn't harsh, just tired, as if she had asked the same question of herself 1,000 times before. Nathaniel shook his head. "No," he said simply. "Money destroyed everything once. I don't expect it to fix anything now. I just wanted to give back what I took, from you, from the world, from myself." There was silence between them, heavy but not hostile. The sound of water trickled from the fountain, and somewhere nearby the faint laughter of children echoed from the pediatric wing. Amelia finally sighed, her gaze softening. "You've changed," she said quietly. "I didn't think it was possible." Nathaniel smiled faintly. "Neither did I." She looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in years, she didn't see the ruthless billionaire who had broken her heart. She saw a man who had been broken and rebuilt piece by piece. "Leo talks about you sometimes," she said after a pause, surprising him. "He says you're the only volunteer who listens when he tells stories about science." Nathaniel's eyes filled with emotion he couldn't hide. "He's bright," he whispered. "He reminds me of someone." Amelia smiled faintly. "He's like both of us," she said. Stubborn, curious, and a little too brave. It was the first time they had spoken openly about Leo, and something shifted between them. Amelia's voice trembled slightly as she continued. "He knows you're special to me. He doesn't know everything, but he senses it." Nathaniel swallowed hard, afraid to breathe too deeply, afraid the moment would vanish. Does he ask about his father?" he asked hesitantly. She looked away, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "Sometimes," she admitted. "I used to tell him that his father was chasing dreams too big for his own heart. But lately, I tell him that maybe his father just needed time to find the right kind of dream." Nathaniel couldn't hold back anymore. Tears rolled freely down his cheeks. "Amelia," he whispered, his voice cracking, "I can't change what I did, but I swear on everything I have left. I'll never walk away again. Not from you, not from him, not from this chance to make things right." Amelia took a deep breath, her hand trembling as she brushed away a tear of her own. "You don't need to swear anything," she said softly. "Just keep showing up. That's all Leo and I ever needed." Those words hit him like a lifeline. Just keep showing up. Simple, powerful, and painfully human. For years he had measured love by grand gestures, thinking forgiveness was something you could buy or earn. But in that moment he realized it was something you built quietly, one honest action at a time. Months later, the new cardiac center opened with a small ceremony. No press, no cameras, just hospital staff, patients, and a few donors. The sign above the entrance read, "The Leo Heart Pediatric Wing." Amelia hadn't known Nathaniel had chosen that name until the day of the unveiling. When she saw it, she turned to him with tears in her eyes, her lips parting in disbelief. "You named it after him?" she whispered. Nathaniel nodded, his voice barely audible. "He deserves to see his name on something good. He deserves to know his life means something to the world." Amelia covered her mouth, overcome with emotion. For a moment she couldn't speak. Then in front of everyone she reached for his hand. It wasn't romantic or dramatic, it was quiet, deliberate, full of gratitude and something deeper. In that single touch, forgiveness passed between them wordlessly. As the months rolled on, Nathaniel became part of their lives in small, steady ways. He would drive Amelia home after long shifts, help Leo with school projects, and sit beside them during quiet dinners. They weren't a family in the traditional sense, not yet, but they were something real, something healing. The pain of the past didn't disappear, but it softened, replaced by moments of shared laughter and understanding. Nathaniel stopped chasing the illusion of perfection and started embracing the beauty of imperfection, the kind of love that didn't demand anything, that simply was. One evening, as they sat on Amelia's porch watching Leo play with his telescope, she turned to him and said, "You know, I used to believe that forgiveness was a word you had to say out loud, but now I think it's something you live every day in every small act of love." Nathaniel smiled, his eyes reflecting the starlight. "Then I'll keep living it," he replied softly, "for as long as I have breath." Amelia looked at him for a long time, then leaned her head against his shoulder. For the first time in years, they both felt whole, not because the past was gone, but because they had learned to carry it together. And so, under the quiet glow of the city lights, the man who had once believed power could buy him the world finally understood the truth. The greatest empire he could ever build was not made of glass or steel, but of hearts that had broken, healed, and found their way back to love.